Hi everybody, and welcome to my week 12 video. I'm going to talk to you about paper 4, which is our final major paper in this course, and it is a researched argument essay paper. So if you want, you can follow along with me by going to content up at the top of our course page and then to major paper assignments and related materials and click on paper 4. So for this final major paper of the course, I'll ask you to take a position on a topic or an issue and argue your point of view persuasively. So this is something that most of you are kind of familiar with doing, and you feel comfortable doing this because you've written this kind of paper before in high school. You may use one of two argument papers that we're going to be reading together in this last unit on which to take a position. So the first one is entitled, Is Google Making Us Stupid? And it's written by Nicholas Carr. It's found in the Norton Field Guide on page 789. And the other choice is An Outbreak of the Irrational by Sarah Dzube, and it is also found in the Field Guide on page 808. So in the Is Google Making Us Stupid piece, Carr argues that the internet negatively affects literacy, so our ability to really read very well and write very well, cognition, and culture. And Dzube argues that vaccines, in her An Outbreak of the Irrational, are important to the health of all citizens, which is kind of an interesting and controversial topic right now with all of the debate over the COVID vaccines. So you'll choose from one of those two texts to focus upon and either agree or disagree with the claims of these authors. And then in addition to that, you have to locate, quote from, and cite one other source on your chosen topic. So either on the internet with Nicholas Carr's piece or on vaccines that you find on your own. So here are the important dates to keep in mind. On Monday the 15th, your revision for paper 1 or 2 will be due before 11:59 p.m. And now that's not something that you absolutely have to submit, but if you were unhappy with your grade on either paper 1 or 2, you can choose to revise one of them to earn a higher grade. There will be absolutely no extensions on this deadline date. I cannot do it because by this point in the semester, we are literally just drowning in grading. And so I cannot make any exceptions there. I'm so sorry. It has to be turned in by the 15th at 11:59 p.m. or I can't accept it. So to submit a revision, you're going to choose again between papers 1 and 2. You'll make all the corrections that I noted in my comments on the graded draft of that paper. So you want to go back into the assignments tab, read through those comments, and submit a revised paper having made all of the corrections that I've suggested, from little things all the way like, oh, you missed a comma here, to really significant items like you don't have a thesis statement, or your organization is off, or you're a whole page short with this paper. And then you're going to submit that revised paper along with a brief 1/2 page document outlining to me the changes that you made. And this will be submitted in the assignments tab. Look for paper revisions. So that is how that will work. And then your new grade will be the average of your original grade and your revised grade. So if you made a 100 on the revision, you know, it's possible to really bring that grade up. Do not, under any circumstances, turn in the same draft to me without having made corrections. If you just turn the same thing into me, that's going to really waste my time and efforts at a time in the semester when I'm super busy anyway. So I'm liable to give you a lower grade than the one you had before. If you do that, don't do it. On Monday the 22nd, that will be the day that you'll submit your responses to the questions on the idea worksheet for paper 4. And again, that deadline will happen at 11:59 p.m. on Monday the 22nd. So you'll click on the assignments tab And as always, you'll answer questions that I give you on the idea worksheet to begin thinking about this paper. And then the very next day, on the 23rd, we kind of have to push it because we're to the end of the semester. You'll write a rough draft of your paper using the template that I'm providing to you from the library. And then you'll use the questions on the self-review sheet that I'm going to give you to help you earn a good grade on this paper. So you need to submit your self-review responses or your partial draft before 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday, the 23rd. And this will serve just like the peer reviews and pre-writings for previous papers, in that 10 points will be deducted from your paper 4 grade if you fail to submit the self-review materials on time. So you'll click on assignments and then on self-review. Notice the words self-review. So what that means is you have got to take it upon yourself now with this last paper to really assume responsibility for your writing. And that's going to involve looking back at previous papers and the comments that I made and the errors that you made and figuring out how not to make those same errors. So then on Monday, the 29th of November, you'll submit the final draft of paper 4 no later than 11:59 p.m. And as always, you'll click on the assignments tab. You'll look for paper 4 final draft. And remember the policy. 10 points are deducted from your paper grade for every calendar day your paper is late, including the day that it's due and weekends. And papers are not accepted after 5 days. So specifics. This paper needs to be at least 2.5 pages long. If you go over that, that's fine, but you have to reach that 2.5 page minimum length requirement. As always, typed, double space, Times New Roman 12-point font, standard margins. And for this assignment, you need 2 sources. So you need one of those 2 texts that I just mentioned, listed on this sheet above, whose topic you're choosing to write about. And you need a second source that comments directly on either the topic of the internet or the topic of vaccines, obviously depending on which of those papers you choose to write about. If you want to add a third or a fourth source, that is of course fine, but you must quote from and or paraphrase from your sources in the body of your paper, and you must cite them in MLA citation, obviously, on your separate works cited sheet at the end of your paper. And as always, we're conforming to a formal academic structure. This is college level writing. So we have our introduction with our thesis at the very end of it. Then we have our supporting paragraphs and our formal conclusion. So the objective of this assignment is to argue persuasively, fairly, and effectively, either for or against a particular topic, experience, or idea that is being expressed in one of those 2 readings from the Norton Field Guide. So to create a successful researched argument essay, here's what you need to be thinking about as you are writing. Have you chosen a title that's reflecting your topic in a creative, informative kind of way? Do you have an interesting hook in place as your opening sentence? Have you clearly explained to your readers the subject matter of your paper in that very first paragraph? If we get to the end of that paragraph and we don't know what you're writing about, we have an issue, right? Do you have a clear thesis statement at the end of that first introductory paragraph that is stating your position clearly without using first person I? Remember, we don't do that in formal writing. Have you discovered at least 3 main points that will outline and support your argument and written a paragraph about each one of those points? Does each paragraph begin with a clear topic sentence that lets your reader know, okay, here's what this paragraph is going to be about, or here's how it connects to what I just said? Have I chosen one of the 2 above mentioned articles or essays with which to agree or disagree? So that's your main job. You're choosing between one of those 2 to either agree or disagree with. And then you're finding a second source to use that can either agree or disagree with your stance, but you have to have a second source. Have I quoted from both my sources and or correctly paraphrased them within the body of my paper, citing correctly in MLA? So I've got to have in parentheses the author's last name and the page number after a quote or after a paraphrase. Have I written a concluding paragraph that sums up my ideas without repeating my thesis word for word? And have I tried to save some particular insight for that conclusion? Do I have that separate works cited page? Are all the sources that I used in my paper cited correctly there? Have I proofread, spell checked, and grammar checked my paper before submitting it? Very important. So here are some examples of thesis statements for the above mentioned topic. First we have, is Google making us stupid? And here's sort of for the idea, this first one, that the internet is causing us to not do so well in certain ways. After carefully considering both sides of the issue, one may conclusively argue that the internet, though able to provide us with the advantage of instant information available at our fingertips, also exerts many negative effects upon our cognition and ability to concentrate. So cognition, our ability to learn and remember, right? And then here's the opposite statement that is saying, you know what? No, I disagree with Nicholas Carr. While some argue that internet use causes human beings to lose focus, lack patience, and develop actual biological changes within the brain, research will prove that the advantages of the World Wide Web far outweigh any skepticism. So this writer is saying, you know what? Okay, so there may be people who argue that the internet isn't good for us, but I'm saying that it is, and I'm going to show you why I'm right, okay? Without, again, using first person I. So we would use Nicholas Carr's piece in both of these instances. If you're pro his ideas and you're agreeing with him that Google makes us stupid, then you would use his source to back you up. And then you would find maybe an additional source that either supports his idea or that you could use to say, the counter-argument might state this. However, careful examination proves that this is incorrect, right? But if you were arguing that Carr is wrong, then you're going to use Carr to say, here's what some people think. However, you know, one may disagree with Nicholas Carr. And here's my other source that explains why that idea of disagreeing with him makes sense. So now here we're going to do the same thing with an outbreak of the irrational. So if you are agreeing with the author there, Sarah Dzubay, you might have a thesis that looks like this. Though some express legitimate reasons for their fear of vaccines, research into the subject will prove that vaccination is the duty of all Americans, not only to themselves, but to others. So this writer is taking the stance of agreeing with the author of An Outbreak of the Irrational and is saying, you know, we need vaccines in our world. So this author will use Sarah Dzubay's piece as support of that, and then find probably another supporting source that agrees with Dzubay. Now here's the opposite of that idea. While one cannot deny the success of many vaccination programs in the United States and throughout the world to eradicate horrific illnesses, research into the subject will prove that the concerns of anti-vaccine activists, including their political and ethical questions, are valid and worthy of consideration. So in this case, you could use Dzubay's piece to inform your reader of how the opposite view feels, and then you might find a second source that agrees with your view, that perhaps vaccines aren't always for the best. And so you have the right to your opinion in any and all cases, right? But you want to support it with logos, not with a strong, controversial, emotional kind of a reaction where you're degrading the opposition, but rather you want to use logos, a solid base of data and research and logical ideas to support your claims when you're writing an argument paper. And that's what the two readings for this week are really all about. And so I want to spend just the last few minutes here kind of talking a little bit about those readings. And the first one, actually you'll find both of them by going to Content and Course Documents. You'll have to hit Load More, and then you'll look at Structuring Successful Argument Papers through the Toulmin Method. So there was a British philosopher named Stephen Toulmin who developed some really important ideas about understanding and shaping argument. And they're so important that we use those ideas in a lot of English comp classes when we're teaching argumentation. So Toulmin said arguments begin with a thesis statement. Notice it's a statement. It's never a question. A statement or a claim, which could be debatable or which could be an assertion that you hope to prove. And it needs to be demonstrated by using logic and evidence. A thesis answers the question, so what? What's the point here? And Toulmin tells us there has to be a logical, persuasive connection between a thesis statement and the reasons to support it. So he calls that connection the warrant. The warrant answers the question, how exactly do I get from my thesis to my evidence? And it's the assumption that makes that thesis seem plausible. So here's an example. Here's a thesis. There are many folk traditions concerning the defining features, can't talk, of poisonous mushrooms. However, there are no general identifiers that apply to all poisonous mushrooms. Therefore, such traditions are unreliable guides, and the use of folk traditions to try to identify edible mushrooms causes mushroom poisoning. So the thesis needs a logical, persuasive connection to any data or reasoning that we're going to use here that support it. And that connection is the warrant. Here it is. Since eating poisonous things are dangerous, therefore it is unwise to rely on folk traditions or remedies to determine which mushrooms might be poisonous, right? So you don't just want to rely on some anecdote that has been handed down over the generations. You need some sort of scientific proof or evidence to be able to discern, I better not eat this, it could kill me, or it's okay to eat this mushroom that's growing wild in my yard. Here's another example. Here's a thesis. Elderly drivers suffer from deteriorating conditions that affect their eyesight, eye-hand coordination, and reflex use. Therefore, there should be a cutoff age for all older drivers in the U.S. So here's the warrant. Since these elderly drivers suffer from deteriorating conditions, they can't see as well anymore, they can't react as quickly anymore, then therefore it's probably unwise to allow them to continue to drive. So because we all know that with age the body deteriorates, this warrant makes sense. Remember that entering an argument can be like walking into a conversation that's already in progress. So a writer is going to have to acquire background knowledge on the history of the topic and knowledge about the audience that you're addressing, the possible oppositional arguments that could be raised in response to you, and the way in which these arguments can be properly, effectively, respectfully addressed and refuted. So you've got to keep all these things in your head. Toulmin tells us, and this is so important, that qualifiers, words and phrases that place limits on our thesis statements or claims, play an essential role in creating effective arguments. So Toulmin encourages us to limit our responsibilities in an argument through the effective use of qualifying words. So for example, here is a totally unqualified claim. Ready? People who don't go to college earn less money than people who do. So, if I said that to you, you could easily shoot down that claim by pointing out a real-life example of someone who didn't graduate from college and now has a gazillion dollars, right? You could find easily examples of people like that. But when I add a simple qualifier phrase, I make my argument much more reasonable and less likely for you to be able to poke holes in it. In most cases, there's my qualifying phrase, people who do not go to college earn less than people who do, right? So now we can take that same concept and apply a qualifier to the thesis about mushrooms. There are many folk traditions concerning the defining features of poisonous mushrooms. However, experts agree that, there's a qualifying phrase, there are no general identifiers that apply to all poisonous mushrooms. Therefore, it seems clear that, there's another qualifying phrase. Such traditions are unreliable guides, and the use of folk traditions or remedies to try to identify edible mushrooms is arguably a frequent cause of mushroom poisoning. So I'm saying, I'm not just saying this, folks. Experts agree. And it seems clear, and it is arguably a frequent cause. So now let's apply that idea to our thesis about elderly drivers. Elderly drivers, though they may be kind and conscientious human beings, sometimes suffer from deteriorating conditions that affect their eyesight, eye-hand coordination, and reflex use, thus possibly impacting their ability to drive safely. A cutoff age for all older drivers in the U.S. offers a viable solution to this growing problem. So remember, the goal is to create a thesis, an argument that uses good old-fashioned psychology to reach your audience. As a writer, you want to express your views in a manner that causes your readers to respond as favorably as possible to your ideas. And this is true in a college paper, and it's true in real life. So some of your readers are going to be reading your paper, and they're already adamantly opposed to your position, right? So don't alienate them even further by offending them or by expressing only an opinion rather than relying on some research and some expert backing, or by using language that feels narrow-minded. Instead, we want to use those qualifiers to soften the blow. So here you see the Toulmin outline with that thesis about the elderly drivers. You see the qualifiers there. You see the warrant. So evidence we could provide would be statistics on, how many people are injured each year in the state of Tennessee by elderly drivers in an accident, for example. Books or journal articles on the subject that offer factual evidence. Quotes from personal accounts of individuals who've been involved in a traffic accident caused by an elderly driver. Our authority is that we're going to cite those experts, people who know the subject well, to establish our own ethos and to back our claims. So now we got to think about the conditions of rebuttal. What are these people who disagree with me going to have to say in response to my ideas? Well, opponents might claim that not all elderly people are affected by physical conditions that impair their ability to drive. In fact, some of them do just fine. And a law legalizing a cutoff age is going to be grossly unfair to those people, right? And could furthermore create hardships for them because maybe some of them live alone and need to drive in order to function, to get to the grocery store, to the doctor's appointments, etc. So here's how you can respond by using more qualifying words. While, which is a qualifying word, it is true that not all elderly persons are affected by physical conditions that impair driving ability. It is also true that a good number are affected, as the following research study clearly shows. And there you insert a quote and a citation, right? While, again, qualifying word, a law legalizing a cutoff age for elderly drivers would indeed be fair and burdensome to some, one may argue that, qualifying phrase, the lives saved justify such a measure. Perhaps, there's another qualifying word, a compromise may be reached through legalizing periodic tests for the elderly, eyesight, reflex, and hearing tests that will ensure the public's safety. So this writer is offering a compromise there. And notice how the response to the opposition attempts to meet the opposition halfway by admitting, some of your claims actually seem reasonable. So let me offer this compromise. Now, whether or not you use that kind of a technique would depend on how logical the opposition's ideas might be and how reasonable a compromise might seem. And I offer you here at the end of this sheet some qualifying words and phrases that you can use in your argument paper. So that's the Structuring Successful Argument Papers through the Toulmin Method document. And the other one that I want you to have a look at this week is using qualifiers. So as we just discussed, a qualifier or qualifying word or phrase is a word or a phrase we're using to qualify or place limits on our claims or ideas, to make them seem more credible, easier to defend, right? So I give you, that same unqualified claim, And again, you could very easily come back and name off any number of people: Steve Jobs, Ellen DeGeneres, Ted Turner. There are tons of them who could just destroy my argument in a flash because I didn't qualify it. And you could come back and say, well, none of them graduated from college and they have $1 gazillion. But if I add those qualifying words like often, frequently, in most cases, much of the time, now it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to offer an immediate rebuttal. And that's why it's so important to use the qualifiers. It's also very important to use ethos. Think ethics. Remember ethos, logos, pathos? So you want to seem credible as a writer. So in other words, you want to come across as respectful and trustworthy. And we can achieve ethos by avoiding words that degrade our opponents or their point of view. So you don't want to say, anyone who disagrees with the idea that vaccines are critical to our nation's health is clearly an idiot. You don't want to say that because you're immediately alienating that person rather than reaching him or her. So I give you again a list of qualifying words, and I give you, just for practice, some sample thesis statements below. And I ask you to try your hand at inserting a qualifier from the list above that allows the thesis to become easier to defend. And also, if necessary, reword it by avoiding using words that degrade your opponent and thus destroy your ethos as a writer. So while you don't have to actually do these for a grade this week, it's a good idea to engage in them. So look at this first one. After reading this so-called creation story, it is evident that everyone who patterns his or her religious beliefs after this baloney is ignorant. Yikes. So that is definitely not qualified, and it definitely does not demonstrate ethos at all. So you don't ever want to call this baloney or tell your opponents they're ignorant. Look at the second one. After a careful analysis regarding the question of abortion, it should be clear to everyone that this act is immoral in every single circumstance. So it's totally unqualified, right? So what's your opponent going to say? Immediately your opponent's going to come back and say, oh, wait a minute. What about in cases where someone has been raped, attacked and raped? What about in cases where the mother is probably going to die if the abortion doesn't occur, where it's physically dangerous for her to have the child? So that's what the opponent's going to come back and say. And if you qualify it, then it's not going to be as easy for them to shoot down your argument. Here's another one. When considering the question of illegal immigration, any person of true ethics will realize that all immigrants should immediately be sent back to their countries regardless of their circumstances. So totally without qualifiers there, right? And essentially what this writer is saying is, you don't have any ethics if you disagree with me. You're totally unethical and immoral if you don't agree with everything I say. So you've instantly alienated your opposition. And secondly, this writer is saying that everyone, all immigrants, should immediately be sent back, regardless of their circumstances. So never mind if they are here because their lives are in danger, and never mind, if they're here legally, So there are no qualifiers. And then the next example, after researching the subject of near-death experiences, it is evident that no person in his right mind could possibly believe such nonsense. So in other words, if you don't believe in NDEs, you're crazy, right? That's not a good way to approach your opponent. And then finally, reality television shows like Jersey Shore and Keeping Up with the Kardashians are trash. And anyone who disagrees is clearly not intelligent. So you see my little addendum there. I said, okay, class, I admit this last one is hard to correct. Ha ha, do your best, though. I may not be a huge Kardashians fan, actually, as you can guess. But again, you're going to alienate anyone who disagrees with you, because first you've called these shows trash, and secondly, you've told them they're dummies. They're clearly not intelligent. They're just a bunch of doofuses, right? So that's not going to make them very likely to even read your paper or consider your views at all. So those are just some examples of what not to do, right? And as you approach this last argumentative paper, you want to keep all of that in mind. So thank you for your patience, and happy writing with paper 4.